The call came while I was presenting my latest design project to a room full of executives. My phone kept buzzing in my pocket, the same number over and over. After the fourth attempt, I excused myself, expecting an emergency. Instead, I heard a voice I hadn't heard in 15 years. Tessa? It's your father. My name is Tessa, and that moment shattered the carefully constructed peace I'd built since I was 15. I stood in the hallway of my office building, watching my reflection in the glass windows distort as my hand trembled around the phone. How did you get this number? I managed to keep my voice steady, professional. The same tone I'd just used to discuss typography and brand cohesion moments ago. Your grandmother, Etta. She's been keeping me updated about you. A pause. I need your help, Tessa. Of course he did. 15 years of silence, and now he needed something. I watched a group of pigeons scatter across the courtyard below, remembering how he used to chase them with me in the park when I was little. Before Lorraine. Before everything fell apart. I'm in a meeting, I said, though my feet remained rooted to the spot. I can't. Please, he cut in. I wouldn't call if it wasn't important. Lorraine and I, we're about to lose everything. The house, our savings. I made some mistakes. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass. That's not my problem. You're doing well, aren't you? The design firm, your own place in the city. I've seen your work online. You're talented, just like your mother was. The mention of my mother sent a jolt through my chest. Don't you dare bring her into this. I know I have no right to ask, he continued, his voice cracking. But we need help. Just hear me out over coffee. 1 hour of your time. That's all I'm asking. Behind me, I could hear my colleagues' muffled voices through the conference room door. My presentation wasn't finished. My life was waiting. The life I'd built without him. The one where I didn't have to remember the sound of screaming matches or the sight of my things packed in garbage bags on the front lawn. Why now? I asked, but I already knew. Money has a way of bringing people back from the dead. Because I'm trying to make things right, he said. And because there are things you need to know. About your mother. About what really happened. My grip tightened on the phone. What things? Not over the phone. Please, Tessa. Just coffee. I should have said no. Should have hung up and walked back into my meeting, back to my orderly life where the past stayed buried. Instead, I heard myself say, tomorrow, 8 a.m. The coffee shop on 4th and Pine. 1 hour. Thank you, he breathed. Thank you, Tessa. After hanging up, I stood there for a long moment, watching my reflection. Same brown hair as my mother, same determined set to my jaw. But my eyes, those were his. I'd spent years avoiding mirrors because of those eyes. My phone buzzed again, a text this time from an unknown number. Looking forward to seeing you, sweetheart. Lorraine. Of course she was listening in. She always had been. I walked back into the conference room, apologizing for the interruption, but my mind was already racing ahead to tomorrow. To coffee with the man who chose his new wife over his daughter. To whatever secrets he claimed to have about my mother. To the chance, perhaps, to finally make them pay for what they did. I smiled at my clients and picked up where I'd left off, but inside, 15 years of carefully buried rage began to stir. I couldn't sleep that night. My apartment felt too quiet, too empty, like the calm before a storm. At 3 a.m, I found myself digging through my closet, pulling out a dusty shoebox I hadn't opened in years. Inside were the fragments of my childhood, photos, report cards, birthday cards. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, lay my mother's silver locket. The one piece of her I'd managed to keep when Lorraine had cleaned house after the funeral. The clasp was still broken. Dad had promised to fix it back when promises meant something. My phone lit up with a text from my grandmother. Be careful tomorrow, sweetheart. Your father isn't the same man you remember. I stared at the message, remembering the day everything changed. I was 12 when he brought Lorraine home for dinner. She'd worn a cream-colored blazer and pearl earrings, her smile as practiced as her posture. Within 6 months, she'd moved in. Within a year, my mother's garden had been paved over for a new driveway. Your father needs a fresh start, Lorraine had said, watching me cry over the destroyed roses. We all do. The fresh start hadn't included me. I arrived at the coffee shop 20 minutes early, choosing a table with a clear view of both exits. When they walked in, the sight of them knocked the air from my lungs. Dad looked older, grayer, his confident salesman's stride replaced by something hesitant. Lorraine, though, she hadn't aged a day, like time itself was afraid to cross her. Tessa, Dad said, pulling out a chair. His hands shook slightly. You look just like your mother. Lorraine's smile tightened. You've done well for yourself. That firm of yours must be paying quite well. Let's skip the small talk, I said, keeping my voice level. Why am I here? Dad glanced at Lorraine before speaking. We've hit some rough times. Investments gone bad, the market crash. We're about to lose the house. Our house, Lorraine corrected. The one we built together. I felt my jaw clench. You mean the house you kicked me out of when I was 15? That was a misunderstanding, Dad started, but Lorraine cut him off. We all made mistakes back then. You were a difficult teenager, Tessa. But we're family. Family helps each other. Family? I pulled out my phone, showing them Lorraine's text from yesterday. Is that why you were eavesdropping on our call? Dad's expression shifted. What text? Lorraine's hand moved to cover his. I was worried about your father. He's been so stressed lately. I just wanted to make sure everything went smoothly. Nothing about this is smooth, I said. You want my money? After everything you did? There's more, Dad said quickly. It's about your mother. About what really happened before she died. The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too warm. Mom died of cancer. I was there. Yes, but... He looked at Lorraine again, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. There were complications with her treatment. Things you don't know about. What things? We should discuss this somewhere more private, Lorraine suggested. Perhaps you could come to the house? See your old room? My old room. The one they converted into a home gym within weeks of throwing me out. Whatever you have to say it here. Dad leaned forward. Your mother's life insurance policy. There were irregularities. Things that could change everything. Before he could continue, Lorraine's phone buzzed. Her face paled as she read the message. We need to go. Now. But we haven't, Dad protested. Now, Calvin. They left in a hurry, leaving me with more questions than answers. As I watched them through the window, I saw Lorraine grab Dad's arm, speaking urgently. He looked back at me once, his expression a mix of regret and fear. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Your mother would be proud of you. Not everyone has the strength to face their past. Ash. I stared at the message, wondering who H was and how they knew about this meeting. Something bigger was happening, something that went beyond a simple request for money. And I was going to find out what it was. After the coffee shop, I drove straight to my grandmother's house. Etta had always been my safe harbor, the one person who'd chosen me over Lorraine's manipulations. But today, she had some explaining to do. I found her in her garden, pruning roses that looked just like the ones Lorraine had destroyed. She didn't seem surprised to see me. I wondered how long it would take you to show up, she said, setting down her shears. Come inside. There's something you need to see. The house smelled like cinnamon and old books, just like always. But instead of heading to the kitchen for our usual tea, Etta led me upstairs to her study. She pulled out a wooden box from behind a row of photo albums. Your mother left these with me, she said, her hands trembling slightly. Made me promise not to show you until you were ready. Inside were dozens of letters, some yellowed with age, others newer. All addressed to me, in my mother's handwriting. She knew she was dying long before she told anyone, Etta said softly. Even before Lorraine came into the picture. I picked up the first letter, dated just weeks before she died. The paper felt fragile, like it might crumble along with my carefully constructed walls. Dear Tessa, if you're reading this, then things have happened exactly as I feared they would. Lorraine isn't who your father thinks she is. I've found proof. The letter shook in my hands. What proof? Keep reading, Etta urged. The next paragraph made my blood run cold. I've discovered discrepancies in the hospital's billing records. Treatments that were ordered but never administered. Money that disappeared. Lorraine worked in the billing department then, before she accidentally met your father at that coffee shop. My phone buzzed. Another text from H. The insurance policy wasn't the only thing that was irregular. Check the hospital records from May 2008. Who's H? I asked Etta. She smiled sadly. Helen Harper. Your old English teacher. She was your mother's best friend before. Well, before Lorraine made sure they stopped speaking. The pieces started falling into place.
Yes.
Harper, who'd tried to help me when things got bad at home. Who'd offer me a place to stay after Lorraine threw me out. Who'd mysteriously lost her teaching position the following year. There's more, Etta said, pulling out another letter. Your mother knew what Lorraine was planning. She tried to warn your father, but a car door slammed outside. Through the window, I saw Lorraine getting out of her Mercedes, her face set in that familiar, determined expression. How did she know I was here? She's been watching the house, Etta said, quickly gathering the letters. Ever since your father called you. She knows about these letters, Tessa. She's been trying to find them for years. The doorbell rang, its chime somehow menacing. Go out the back, Etta said, pressing the box of letters into my hands. Take these to Helen. She'll know what to do with them. But
Now, Tessa.
Your mother died trying to protect you from that woman. Don't let her win again. I slipped out through the back door as Etta answered the front. Lorraine's voice drifted through the house, honey-sweet and dangerous. Etta, dear. I thought I saw Tessa's car outside. Is she here? Just missed her, Etta replied coolly. She was dropping off some old photos. From my hiding spot behind the garage, I watched Lorraine's shadow move across the windows. You know, Calvin's very worried about her. All this dwelling on the past, it's not healthy. Neither is lying about killing someone's mother, Etta shot back. The silence that followed was deafening. I clutched the box of letters to my chest and ran to my car, my mother's words burning in my mind. Lorraine wasn't just after money. She was trying to cover her tracks that led straight back to my mother's death. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Lorraine stood on Etta's porch, watching me go. She lifted her phone to her ear, and I knew she was calling my father. The game had changed. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about justice. And I finally had the proof to get it. I found Helen Harper in a small coffee shop across town, grading papers just like she used to 15 years ago. When she saw the box of letters in my hands, she simply nodded and gestured to the chair across from her. Your mother was right about everything, she said, closing her red pen. But those letters are only part of the story. I placed the box between us. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Would you have believed me? She pulled out a manila envelope from her bag. After Lorraine got me fired, I started digging. Found some interesting connections between her time at the hospital and several other patients who died under suspicious circumstances. My phone buzzed. Dad calling. I declined it. She wasn't just after money, Helen continued, spreading out documents across the table. She targeted wealthy patients, manipulated their treatments, then somehow ended up involved with their families afterward. Your father wasn't her first mark. But my mother wasn't wealthy. No, but your father's company was about to go public. Your mother discovered the pattern, and Helen's voice trailed off as someone entered the coffee shop. My father stood in the doorway, looking lost and older than he had yesterday. When he spotted us, his face went pale. Tessa, wait, he called as I started gathering the papers.
Please.
I know what this looks like. Do you? I shot back. Do you know what any of this looks like? He walked over, his hands shaking. Lorraine, she told me everything. About the hospital, about Helen's investigation. She's scared, Tessa. Says you're trying to destroy our family with lies. Helen stood up. Still believing her stories, Calvin? Even after what happened to Margaret. Dad flinched.
Who?
Her first husband. The one who died under similar circumstances to Claire. Helen pulled out another document. Your wife has quite a history of being in the right place at the wrong time. The color drained from Dad's face. That's not. She said she was widowed. She was, Helen said grimly. 3 times before you.
My phone buzzed again.
A text from Etta. Lorraine just left. She took something from my study. Be careful. We need to go, I said, standing up.
Now.
But Dad grabbed my arm.
Wait.
There's something else. Something I never told anyone. He pulled out an old envelope from his jacket. Your mother left this with me the day before she died. Made me promise to open it if anything happened to her. I never did. Why not? Because Lorraine found me first. Told me Claire had been delusional at the end, paranoid. That opening it would only hurt you more. His voice cracked. I wanted to believe her. It was easier than facing the truth. Suddenly, the coffee shop door opened again. Lorraine stood there, holding a familiar-looking file. I knew you'd be here, she said, her voice eerily calm. Helen always did like playing detective. She held up the file. Looking for this? Your mother's original medical records? The ones that disappeared from the hospital? Dad stepped forward. Lorraine, what did you do? What I had to do, she replied, her mask finally cracking. What I always do. They were going to take everything from me, just like you're trying to do now. She reached into her purse, and I saw something metallic glint in the fluorescent light. Nobody's taking anything, Helen said, slowly reaching for her phone. Lorraine's laugh was hollow. That's where you're wrong. I've spent 15 years building this life. 15 years making sure the past stayed buried. She pulled out a small revolver. And I'm not about to let you destroy it all with some letters and old hospital records. The coffee shop went silent. Dad stepped in front of me, his voice steady for the first time in years. That's enough, Lorraine. I should have stopped you 15 years ago. I'm not failing my daughter again. As Lorraine's finger tightened on the trigger, I realized that revenge wasn't what I wanted anymore. I just wanted the truth. And now, with my father finally choosing me, the truth was about to cost us everything. The coffee shop erupted into chaos. Someone screamed, chairs scraped against the floor, and Helen dove for her phone. But all I could focus on was Dad, standing between me and Lorraine's trembling gun. Move, Calvin, Lorraine said, her perfectly manicured fingers steady on the trigger. This isn't about you. That's where you're wrong, he replied. It's always been about me. My weakness. My choices. A siren wailed in the distance. Lorraine's eyes darted to the window, then back to us. We're leaving. All of us. Now. She gestured toward the back door with the gun. Dad started to protest, but I grabbed his arm. Do what she says. Outside, the evening air felt thick with tension. Lorraine directed us to her car, keeping the gun partially concealed but ever present. Get in, she ordered. We're going home. Home. The word felt like poison. As we drove, I watched the familiar streets blur past, each turn bringing us closer to the house where everything had fallen apart. Dad sat rigid beside me in the back seat, his hand finding mine in the darkness. I should have read that letter, he whispered. Should have trusted Claire. Quiet, Lorraine snapped, but her voice cracked. You have no idea what I've sacrificed for this family. Family? The word escaped me before I could stop it. You destroyed our family. You killed my mother. The car swerved sharply, then steadied. Your mother was going to ruin everything. She found the records, started asking questions about Margaret and Thomas. Your other husbands, Dad said quietly. The ones who died. Lorraine's laugh was brittle. They were weak. Sick. Just like Claire. I simply helped nature take its course. We pulled into the driveway of my childhood home. The roses were long gone, replaced by perfectly manicured shrubs. Sterile. Controlled. Just like everything in Lorraine's world. Inside, she commanded. The house smelled different. No more cinnamon and old books like Adetta's. This place smelled of artificial lavender and fear. Family photos lined the walls, carefully curated to show the perfect family. Me, conspicuously absent. Sit down. Lorraine gestured to the living room couch. We're going to fix this. All of it. How? I asked. By killing us too? Don't be dramatic, she scoffed, but her hand tightened on the gun. We just need to understand each other. I did what was necessary.
Claire was weak.
She would have dragged Calvin down with her illness, her neediness. I made it quick, painless. I saved this family. Dad's face crumpled. You didn't save us. You destroyed us. A noise from the kitchen made us all freeze. Lorraine spun around, gun raised, just as Helen stepped into view, holding a familiar-looking file. Looking for this? Helen asked, holding up my mother's medical records. I made copies. They're already with the police. Lorraine's composure finally shattered. The gun wavered between Helen and us, her perfect mask cracking to reveal the desperate woman beneath. You don't understand, she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. I had nothing before this. No family, no security. I built this life. I earned it. By killing innocent people? I stood up, ignoring Dad's attempt to pull me back. By destroying families? I made them better. Lorraine screamed. Stronger, without the weak ones holding them back. The gun swung toward me. In that moment, I saw something I'd never noticed before, fear in Lorraine's eyes. Not of being caught, but of being abandoned, of being weak. You're right, I said softly. Weak people do destroy families. Her finger tightened on the trigger just as police sirens filled the air outside. Red and blue lights flooded through the windows, casting strange shadows across Lorraine's face. That's why you have to destroy everything, I continued. Because you're the weakest one of all. The gun fired just as Dad lunged forward, and my world exploded into chaos once again. The gunshot echoed through the house as Dad slammed into me, knocking us both to the floor. Pain exploded in my shoulder, hot and sharp. Through the haze, I heard screaming, Helen's voice, police sirens, Lorraine's hysterical laughter. You see, Lorraine shouted over the chaos. He chose me again, just like always. But Dad was pressing his hands against my wound, his tears falling onto my face.
I'm so sorry, Tessa.
God, I'm so sorry. The room spun with red and blue lights as officers burst through the doors. Someone knocked the gun from Lorraine's hand, but she kept laughing, that horrible, broken sound that had haunted my teenage years. She'll never forgive you now, Calvin. Lorraine called as they handcuffed her. Just like Claire never did. The paramedics arrived, their voices distant and professional as they worked on my shoulder. Through the pain, I caught fragments of conversation. Through and through, lucky, hospital. But all I could focus on was Dad's face, aged decades and minutes, and the envelope that had fallen from his pocket during the chaos. Mom's last letter. Read it, I whispered as they lifted me onto the stretcher. Please. His hands shook as he opened the envelope, yellowed with 15 years of waiting. As he read, his face crumpled. Claire knew, he choked out. She knew what Lorraine was doing with her medication. She tried to tell me, but I didn't want to believe someone I loved could be capable of. Like father, like daughter. I said, the words bitter in my mouth. The paramedics started moving me toward the ambulance. Dad tried to follow, but I turned away.
Don't.
Just
Don't.
Tessa, please. You had 15 years to choose me, I said, fighting against the darkness creeping into my vision. 15 years to read that letter, to face the truth. But you were too weak. Helen appeared beside the stretcher, her face grim. I'll ride with her. As they loaded me into the ambulance, I caught one last glimpse of my childhood home. Lorraine in the back of a police car, still laughing. Dad standing in the doorway, clutching Mom's letter, looking lost. The perfect family photos visible through the window, mocking everything we'd become. The pain medication kicked in during the ride, making everything fuzzy. Helen held my hand, talking softly about evidence and trials, about justice finally being served. But justice felt hollow now. Mom was still dead. Dad was still a coward. And I had a bullet hole where my anger used to live. We got her, Helen said. It's over. But it wasn't over. The physical wound would heal, but the rest, the betrayal, the lost years. The knowledge that Dad had chosen willful ignorance over protecting his own daughter, that would never heal cleanly. In the emergency room, As doctors worked to repair the damage, I drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time I surfaced, I heard different voices, Etta praying softly, Helen talking to police officers, Dad begging to see me. She doesn't want visitors, a nurse said firmly. I'm her father. That's not what her medical records show. According to these, she removed you as next of kin 15 years ago. Another voice cut through the haze, Lorraine's lawyer, speaking to reporters outside my room. My client has a documented history of mental illness. The deaths of her previous husbands were thoroughly investigated. I wanted to scream, to tell them about Mom's letters, about the medical records, about years of calculated manipulation. But the words wouldn't come. The truth felt trapped inside me, like the bullet they'd just removed. A detective appeared, wanting a statement. Helen tried to intervene, but I forced myself to speak. Why did she do it? I asked. All of it. The detective's face softened. Some people can't bear to be alone. They'd rather destroy a family than risk being abandoned by one. As morphine pulled me under again, I realized that's exactly what I'd been doing too, destroying myself to prove I didn't need the family that abandoned me. And now, lying in a hospital bed with a bullet wound for my stepmother and a heart wound for my father, I never felt more alone. 3 weeks after the shooting, I sat across from Lorraine in a prison visiting room. She looked smaller without her designer clothes and perfect makeup, but her eyes still held that calculating gleam. I didn't expect you to come, she said, hands folded neatly on the metal table. Hoping for an apology? I want to understand. The wound in my shoulder throbbed, a constant reminder of what brought us here. Was any of it real? Did you ever care about Dad? Or was he just another mark? Her smile faltered. Your father was different. He loved so completely, so blindly. It made him perfect, until you started asking questions. Like Mom did. Claire was weak. Lorraine snapped, then caught herself. She would have dragged him down with her illness, her neediness. I saved him from that. By killing her? By setting him free. Lorraine leaned forward. You don't understand what it's like. Always being temporary. Disposable. I made myself necessary. I made myself family. By destroying other families. I improved them. Removed the weak links. Her voice cracked slightly. My own mother taught me that. Nobody wants a burden, she'd say. So, I learned to be useful. Necessary. Perfect. The truth hit me like another bullet. You were scared. All this time, you were just terrified of being abandoned. Lorraine's mask slipped completely. Everyone leaves. Unless you give them a reason to stay. Unless you make yourself indispensable. But they didn't stay, did they? Your other husbands? My father? Your father chose me, she snarled. Over and over. He chose me. No. Dad's voice came from behind me. I hadn't told him I was coming, but somehow he'd known. I chose fear. I chose denial. Because facing the truth meant facing my own cowardice. Lorraine's eyes widened. Calvin, I read Claire's letter, he continued, sitting beside me. All of it. About how she discovered what you were doing. About how she begged me to listen. I chose not to see it, because seeing it meant admitting I'd brought a monster into our home. I saved you, Lorraine whispered. I saved us. You destroyed us, I said. And now you're going to spend the rest of your life alone. The very thing you feared most. Lorraine lunged across the table, her fingers clawing for my throat. Guards rushed in, restraining her as she screamed. You're just like her.
Weak.
Pathetic. You'll die alone, too. As they dragged her away, I saw something I'd never noticed before. A small scar on her wrist, old and faded. The kind you get from handcuffs. She was 12 when her mother abandoned her, Dad said quietly. Left her chained to a radiator for 3 days. I found the records after everything. That doesn't excuse what she did. No, he agreed. But it explains it. We're all shaped by our wounds, Tessa. The question is whether we let them make us stronger or turn us into monsters. I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in 15 years. The guilt in his eyes, the grief, the desperate hope for redemption. I'm not ready to forgive you, I said. But I'm ready to stop letting this destroy me. Through the window, we could still hear Lorraine screaming about family, about weakness, about love and betrayal. But her words had lost their power. They were just the echoes of a wounded child who'd learned the wrong lessons about survival. Mom's roses, I said suddenly. The ones Lorraine paved over. They're still there, aren't they? Under the driveway. Dad nodded. Nothing that's strong really dies. It just waits for the right moment to bloom again. As we left the prison, I felt something shift inside me. The wound in my shoulder would leave a scar, but scars were just reminders of what hadn't killed us, of what we'd survived. And sometimes, surviving was its own form of revenge. 6 months after Lorraine's conviction, I stood in my grandmother's garden, helping her plant new roses. The trial had ended with multiple life sentences, not just for Mom's death, but for 3 other murders spanning 2 decades. Justice, they called it. But justice felt different than I'd imagined. Your mother loved these yellow ones best, Etta said, patting the soil around a fresh planting. Said they reminded her of sunshine after rain. Dad appeared at the garden gate, hesitant. He'd been showing up like this lately, not pushing, just being present. Today, he carried a familiar wooden box. Found this while clearing out the house, he said. There's one more letter we haven't read. The house, my childhood home, was being sold. Dad had decided to donate the proceeds to a domestic violence shelter, a choice that felt like the first real step toward redemption. Inside the box was a letter dated the day before Mom died, but it wasn't addressed to me or Dad. It was to Lorraine. Dear Lorraine, I read aloud. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. Not because of your manipulation of my medication, though I know about that. I'm choosing to go on my terms, leaving you with the one thing you fear most, the truth about yourself. Etta and Dad moved closer as I continued reading. You think you've won, that you'll finally have the family you desperately want. But you'll never keep them. Not because they'll leave you, but because you'll destroy them first. Your fear of abandonment will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. This letter is my gift to you, the understanding you never wanted to face. My hands shook. She chose to die? To protect you, Etta said softly. She knew Lorraine would be careful with her next victim after a suspicious death. Knew she'd take years to strike again. Years that would give you time to grow strong enough to face this. She sacrificed herself to give me a chance, I whispered. Dad wiped his eyes. Claire always was the strongest of us all. Helen appeared at the garden gate, carrying case files. She'd retired from teaching, now working as a victim's advocate. They're reopening 3 more cases, she said. Lorraine's past is unraveling. I looked at the yellow roses, their faces turned toward the sun. Mom had known the truth about strength. It wasn't about revenge or justice. It was about protecting what mattered, even if that meant letting go. There's something else, Dad said, pulling out an old photograph. Mom and I in the garden, surrounded by roses, both laughing. But in the background, partially hidden, was a young woman I'd never noticed before. She had Lorraine's eyes. Her sister, Helen explained, died under mysterious circumstances when Lorraine was 20. The case that started it all. The final piece clicked into place. Lorraine hadn't just been afraid of abandonment. She'd been trying to prevent it, eliminating anyone who might leave her first. A twisted kind of protection that had consumed her. What do we do with all this? I asked, gesturing to the letters, the photos, the weight of understanding. We plant roses, Etta said simply. We grow something beautiful from the ashes. Dad picked up a shovel. Together? I looked at him, really looked at him. The man who'd failed me, who'd chosen blindness over truth, who was finally learning to see. Not healed, but healing. Like the garden. Like me. Together, I agreed. As we worked, I thought about Mom's final gift, not just time to grow stronger, but the understanding that true strength comes in many forms. Sometimes it's confronting the truth. Sometimes it's choosing forgiveness. And sometimes it's simply planting roses, knowing that beauty can bloom even in soil stained by tragedy. Later, I found one last note tucked inside the photograph. Mom's handwriting, faded but clear. Remember, sweetheart, The thorns protect the roses, but they don't define them. I tucked the note away and kept digging, making space for new growth in soil that had known both love and pain. Above us, the yellow roses turned their faces to the sun, reaching always toward the light.